Good to see everybody here today as we consider the departure of Gary Elliott from our midst. I can't help but think of one of the first encounters I had with Dr. Elliott. Was an English teacher at Harding. I never had him for a teacher, but I went out to the tennis courts one day there in town to play tennis with my younger sister, who herself had been on a boys' tennis team back in high school. She was a freshman at Harding when I was a senior, and so we went out there to knock a few balls around, and there was Gary Elliott playing singles with Tom Statham, who taught Western Civ. They invited us to play doubles, and so we accepted the invitation. And, not knowing the level of expertise of my sister, Dr. Elliott hit this one serve to her forehand gently. And Marianne was not always that accurate, but if she hit it right, and every now and then she did, she could just belt that thing so hard and fast. Well, it went hard and fast straight into the stomach of Tom Statham, and that caused, he was embarrassed, and you could see a kind of mixture of anger and embarrassment, but then Gary started laughing. I've never enjoyed many tennis experiences as much as I did that one. But Gary Elliott was always so very gracious, and he's been nothing but kind to us, and I know to you as well. It's just sad to see him go further out from our sphere of distance away. So maybe we'll look forward to him getting to still visit occasionally. We're looking at the Gospel of Matthew today, chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. If you have a Bible, you're invited to follow along. If you don't happen to have a Bible, I printed out just for you the scriptures on the handout that you have today. That is the NIV translation of those verses. Please stand for the reading of God's Word as we read together Matthew 2, 1 through 12. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But to you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, and are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them exactly the time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search diligently for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Thank you. Please be seated. May God's blessing be on the reading of his word. I have made mention before a statistic that I thought was a rather shocking and disappointing statistic about the American military, and that was during Desert Storm, we had a mental health officer come to our chaplain training class that we went through. It's a year-long training course for people who were to become hospital chaplains for the Army. I was not in the Army, but I took part in their class. And so this mental health major came down and he was describing what happened in Desert Storm. He said 1 out of 10 soldiers was sent home early because of what I guess they would call battle stress or critical incident stress or post-traumatic stress as it would endure later, but they were just not able to do what they were trained to do because they were not ready in their mind. And that's a tough thing. You think back toward World War II, and would that have happened? There is no way that would have happened. There was battle stress in World War II, and people were temporarily disabled to a large extent. They were given the charge of a chaplain, and in the daily administration of worship services, these people would be reminded of the presence and the power of God and get it together and be once again prepared to do what they were sent to do. Now, that is not a pacifist standpoint that I have just shared with you, but it is one that seemed to serve well during World War II. But you ask the question, why weren't they ready? I'm not here to discuss that necessarily, but they just weren't ready. And you have to wonder what it was that made them not prepared to deal with the harshness of life in a wartime environment. Well, as you begin to look at the birth of Jesus in the story that we've read together, you see that there were changes in the air in Palestine. As you read this story, over and over again, there is this periodic reminder of another prophecy that was fulfilled in this story, and we'll take a look at more of those next week. But we see that changes were in the air, and there is this big question, will the people of Palestine be ready for their Messiah? And there is a resounding no that comes from the scripture reading. We see the absolute lack of readiness in the part of Herod, who feigns to be wanting to join them in the worship of this king, only to find out who he is so he can kill him. And that not having worked out through the help of the wise men, he, of course, responded by murdering all the people below the age 2 that were in the city of Bethlehem. They were not ready, and you wonder, why is that? Well, I'll get back to that in a minute. I want to point out 3 main points in my lesson today. First of all, there was recognition for the King of the Jews. This one whose entry was so striking. There was international recognition for this King of the Jews. He was visited by wise men from the east. If you have an older translation, it'll say the Magi from the east. That word is the derivation of our word magician. In fact, some of the older translations will go back to Daniel 2 and talk about the magicians that served in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. They were not the kind of people pulling rabbits out of hats or doing card tricks. They were wise men. They were supposed to understand, like, the king's dream and be able to tell him both his dream and the interpretation, and they couldn't do it. And so they start rounding up the Magi to kill him. That was Nebuchadnezzar's decree. And so they come to get Daniel and his friends, and Daniel asks the question, well, why do they want to kill us? Why is this decree coming out? And it was explained to him, and you know the story. He sent word back to please allow for another day or 2, and Daniel comes in and tells the king both the dream and the interpretation of the dream. Well, Daniel enjoyed a very long and successful career working as a magi over in ancient Babylon. Of course, there wasn't ancient Babylon anymore. That world power had been overthrown, and you had the Greco-Roman, the Alexander the Great and his folks come in. and displace Babylon, and after that Rome, and so these different succession of powerhouses politically, but the culture remained, and the Magi remained, and these people may have been somewhat influenced by the influence of Daniel, even though it had been a long time in the making. They understood things in terms of the appearance of a star that was not frowned upon. It is not looked upon with askance. It's not a part of astrology, which is not, that's more astronomy. You see, the position of the stars, that's astronomy. Well, anyway, there is this insight that they have, and they come to worship this person who is born King of the Jews. And that's an interesting thing, because it makes me wonder, did they go to worship newborn kings in other lands, or was it just Palestine? Well, it seems like it's just Palestine. What is it that they know about the Jews that would make this newborn King of Jews so very special in their sight? They have come a long way around the Fertile Crescent to get to where Palestine is, from over in the Tigris-Euphrates area. They've made this long and arduous trip, dangerous trip, expensive trip, to find Jesus and give him objects of adoration and worship. Who were they? They were the wise men. They seemed to understand a certain amount of messages from the Lord God Almighty. They came to honor this one that they call the King of the Jews. And so there was international recognition. Secondly, there was celestial recognition. Now, if you begin to look at stars, I discovered a thing when I was teaching junior ROTC, and that is the stars during a night change places. Now, if you're looking at the North Star, that one stays about the same spot in the sky, but the others change places. And so if you're looking at a certain constellation at 7 p.m., and you look again about 9 p.m., that's not going to be in the same place in the sky. It's going to be there if it hasn't dipped down below the horizon, but things change. But this star seemed to be on a track. It wasn't the North Star, because the North Star stays in one place. And it wasn't the other stars, because they rotate as the Earth rotates. Actually, it's the Earth that rotates, but you see they change positions. But this star was different. Now, I'd like to understand more about how a star shows the direction they were supposed to go. And I would like even more to understand how a star shows the destination, because now the star has stopped. And the wise men, when they saw the star stop, were very much rejoicing. And I don't understand that, but that's okay. I don't have to understand it to appreciate the truth of God's word in it. And so you see, there is recognition from a star. A God-appointed heavenly body that does things that normal stars don't do, that is giving recognition to the birth of the Messiah. That one person in the history of all time that is going to provide that blessing of salvation through the Jews to all the world. What an incredible event. And to think that that was recognized by a star that God sent. There was international recognition, there was celestial recognition, and there was local recognition. Here was this Herod the Great, who came from Idumea. We might want to call it Edom if it had been 300 or 400 years earlier, but Edom had been destroyed, and the area is called Idumea, sometimes maybe Nabatea. There is still a highway that runs from Petra down in what we would want to call Edom, the Nabatean area today, all the way up to Damascus. It's called the King's Highway. It was there when the Jews were, they weren't called Jews, and the Hebrews were leaving Egypt and going into the Promised Land. So it's an interesting thing to go back and take a look at that. But here's this king that comes from down south, we could say. And he has pulled himself up by his own bootstraps. He's married in a good way to achieve a certain position. And he has curried the favor of the Caesar at the time. And he's been appointed as king of the Jews. And he has engaged in some incredible architectural buildings like the temple. The temple that Herod built was after the fashion of a lot of pagan temples in something of its makeup, but it was still a very glorious thing that even Jesus' disciples in Matthew 24 comment on what a great structure this is that Herod had built. He built the tower out there on the side of a mountain. They made a movie about it, and I can't remember the name of the movie, but anyway, he built some places that were just world-renowned, very impressive. He did that on the burden of high taxes to the people. And so there was a lot of people that didn't like the high taxes very much. But you see, he is upset by the question, where is he who is born King of the Jews? Herod wasn't born King of the Jews. He had to attain that through his own accomplishments. Here is one who is born King of the Jews. That sounds pretty certain. That sounds like maybe it would displace his own dynasty. We don't have a particular reason to think it was any worry to Herod himself because he was an older man. He only lived another couple of years. But it says, with him all Jerusalem. So there's some other people, evidently the leaders, and that would be the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the priests and that kind of people. He goes to them and he asks, where is the Messiah supposed to be born? And what amazes me is they knew the answer. That amazes me because, there's this kind of a difficult verse to totally understand from Micah chapter 5 and verse 2 that talks about this one that would be born. But they knew the answer, and there's no fanfare. You don't see anything about Bethlehem being treated in any special way. It was the city of David. And so when there was this census taking place, Mary and Joseph dutifully go from their home in Galilee, in Nazareth of Galilee, down 8 miles southeast of Jerusalem to the city of David, because that's how the lineage would line up. They go down there, and there must have been a lot of people because there was no room in the inn, so there was a little bit of extra excitement going on account of a census, but it's just a census. And it would seem, I guess Mary and Joseph had an idea of something special about to happen, but they didn't know exactly what. And so these guys know the city, but it's striking to me that there was no sign going into Bethlehem that said, future birthplace of the Messiah. Can you imagine? That would have been great for tourism. They could have built up the local income by putting up a sign that said, birthplace of the future Messiah. You go through Hot Springs today, and there's a sign that says childhood play, a place where Bill Clinton was raised as a child. Hot Spring. He wasn't born there, but that's where he was raised. And if you go 12 miles down the road to Pineview, Bobby Bones is from Pineview. And if you listen to country music, there's a disc jockey in Nashville that was born down there in Pineview that more famous today than Bill Clinton, maybe, if you listen to country music. And so, these places have these signs, but in Bethlehem, there's no indication anywhere of any recognition that Bethlehem was the birthplace of the Messiah until Herod asks the question. And it strikes me that they knew an academic answer to the question, but the practical outworkings of it they had never considered. What would a Herod do when wise men come announcing the birth of one who is born King of the Jews? what would he do to that person? In fact, it makes me kind of wonder, what were these wise men thinking, going, the first person they seem to talk to is the king, asking him where the next king just got born. He hadn't heard it, wasn't his kid. And so he's kind of wondering, and he realizes this is a threat, and no good thing is going to come out of that. They knew the city. But all of these people that were the leaders of the Jewish religion at the time, they weren't ready. Herod announces, tell you wise men, tell me where he is so that I can come worship him too. And I would have to say their life experience at that point would have been enough to tell them, Herod is not telling the truth here. Why would a current sitting king want to come worship some baby? Doesn't make a terrible amount of sense. Then there's the religious leaders, all Jerusalem with him. Those religious leaders, they never did understand where Jesus was born, but everything that ever happened by way of Jesus, they weren't ready for. They weren't ready for him to call a spade a spade. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. They weren't ready for him to tell a story about a husbandman, a owner of a vineyard who gets people to work this vineyard. He goes to a foreign country and he sends his son back to take the proceeds that he was due, and they kill the son, etc., etc. You understand that Jesus tells the story about the religious leaders of his own day and their role in Jewish society in that day. They're not ready. From earlier on in Jesus' ministry, they're plotting to kill him. That intent grows in its fervor within their gut, so much so that finally Jesus makes himself vulnerable by coming to the city and teaching in the temple on a daily basis, and they finally make their move at the assistance of Judas so that they can kill, so that they can crucify that supposed king, that imposter from their viewpoint. They did not see him as Messiah at all. They weren't ready. Which raises an interesting question for us. They weren't ready for Jesus' first coming. The question is, will we be ready for Jesus' second coming? For Jesus said in Matthew 25, in those verses that I've listed, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. And you remember the parable, how the bridegroom tarried. He was late arriving, and there were 10 virgins, 5 wise virgins, 5 other virgins that weren't wise. The wise virgins had an extra flask of oil, and they could pour more oil into their lamps and keep the fires burning. We'll leave the light on for you. That was their motto. And so we have then this process of neglect on the part of the unwise virgins. They are waiting. They didn't bring any extra. They had not planned for the contingency that the groom would be delayed. And so when the oil in their lamps was burned up, that's all they had. And I wonder what they were thinking at that point. Maybe it wouldn't have been too late if they had gone immediately. But of course, bridegroom might show up any minute. They might miss out. But here's what I suspect. They didn't bring any extra because they didn't have it. If you don't have it, if you hadn't made your weekly trip to Walmart at the right time and gotten that extra oil, I don't think they had any. They'd have probably brought it. But they didn't bring any. They burned, and they saw the oil going down, and then it goes out. And I guess they figured they could borrow some from the others because maybe they hadn't used all the extra oil up in their flasks. But these others realized we have no guarantee of when the groom's going to show up, and we'll need to use that other oil at a later time when we run out again, perhaps. And so, no, you can't borrow some of ours. We might all be rendered in the dark if we give away part of our oil. So they had to go and get some more oil, and they weren't there when the bridegroom showed up. And so there's this point. It's made in Matthew 24, verse 4, therefore you also must be ready. For the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Did you hear that? The Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. And I know that people today who talk about the imminent return of Jesus maybe kind of looked upon with a certain degree of doubt, because that's not the typical kind of message that people in our fellowship preach, and maybe in other fellowships, but we don't talk about that all that much, because after all, people were talking about the imminent return of Jesus during the days of the Jimmy Carter gas shortage. And people were talking about the imminent return of Jesus when Russia invaded Afghanistan. And people have been talking about the imminent return of Jesus at all kinds of world events. We have another world event, and Jesus might be coming. And Jesus' point is to say, I will come when you don't expect it. And I would say we are looking at a phenomenon in our day that is unique in terms of the overall world implications, economically, and in a lot of other ways, politically, etc. Might it be possible? Well, you've probably heard of Pat Robertson. He anticipates an election that Donald Trump will win in 2024, and then in 2025 Jesus will return. Nice of him to nail it down for us. But if the verse is true that says Jesus will return in a day and hour that you don't expect him, then I would guess maybe Pat Robertson's already missed a boat. Whatever. Jesus might come back, Jesus might not come back, but the other side of that same coin is we don't know when we're going to die, do we? We don't know what kind of difficulty we will have, do we? When I was in Afghanistan, I saw people worshiping and praising God and then going to supper. And you know what? They weren't the ones worrying. When I was in Saudi Arabia and the USS Cole was blown up, there were all kinds of people that thought Jesus was about to return back then. But I was with a group up in the chapel part of this building, and we were doing a Bible study on the book of Romans. We got done, went for ice cream after it was over, and man, the street, it was like a ghost town. And so there was one guy at the desk in the recreation facility, and we asked him, where is everybody? He said, didn't you hear the loudspeakers? Take cover, take cover, take cover, you know. And the rest of that tour, I dealt with people who thought Jesus was just about to return. And it can happen before you know it. It can happen after you know it, but it won't happen when you expect it. Jesus said, you must also be ready. What do you need to do to be ready? Some of us may have this inherent gut feeling that we're not ready, but we don't exactly know what it is we need to do. And I promise you, Jesus said, ask and it will be given. If you ask him, you will find out what you need to do. It may be different for you than it is for me. But I believe it's a good time in the course of world history to be ready, because your days of fellowship with the Lord will be indeed a blessing to your life, whether the end comes or not. It is up to you to respond to his invitation to be ready. Are you? Will you come as we stand and sing?